Hello, everyone. So, this is the third episode of our evolution series. And in this one, we'll finally be going over universal common descent and the logic behind why a lot of evolutionary biologists infer common descent. And in the episode following this one, what we'll be doing is we'll be exploring whether or not universal common descent is even testable in of itself. And with regards to this episode, we're just going to be looking at how particular people infer data to conclude that universal common descent is occurring. Just to start off with a definition of universal common descent, it's essentially the hypothesis that all living organisms share a single common ancestor in the kind of the distant past, right? And to make that kind of a bit more simple, it's essentially the view that life forms this kind of giant tree of life, right? And that this tree of life connects every species through branching ancestors. So you can think of it as like a trunk, and the trees of the trunk are all kind of distant cousins, and all of them converge to the trunk itself, which is a common origin point. That's what's known as universal common descent. And so, what we'll be doing in this episode again is we'll be examining why many scientists believe this notion of universal common descent and critically engage with some of those arguments. And just to spoil the entire discussion, we'll be showing that most of these arguments, or practically all of these arguments, are rested on assumptions that have to do with these philosophical notions that I've explained in the earlier two episodes, whether that be naturalism, methodological naturalism, philosophical naturalism, or their specific views of Occam's razor. And so we'll be taking a look at all of those within this episode. So when I say tree of life, what does that imply, right? Now, scientists, what they do is they observe that organisms can be grouped into similarities. And once you group these organisms into similarities, you'll notice that life itself naturally clusters into what's known as a nested hierarchy. A nested hierarchy, it's something like a group within groups themselves, right? So, for example, cats and dogs are different species, but both are mammals. Now, mammals are also a subset of vertebrates. So you can already see that there's this nested hierarchy in the sense that there's this overall species group, and then it gets even more specific to something called like a genre, and then it gets even more specific to families. Again, you'll end up having groups within groups themselves. And so this kind of nested classification is exactly what we would expect if life had diversified from a common ancestor. Now, what universal common descent posits is that it says that these groups that we can form of these life forms, they reflect actual genetic relationships, right? So organisms that kind of look more similar are believed to be more closely related in terms of ancestry. And so if universal common descent is true, the pattern of similarity across all species, it should line into one consistent family tree. And so the logic here is that essentially the more similarity, then the more common descent. Or in other words, similarity equals shared ancestry. Now, a kind of fundamental assumption, as I said in the last slide, is that similarity is common ancestry, right? And so, what's the name for that in the literature is homology, right? So the assumption is that because two independent things seemingly have the same function, or they look similar in terms of appendages, in terms of the genetic code, in terms of whatever it may be, whatever characteristic you're looking at, then therefore they are more closely related than any other two creatures, essentially. What's important is that this is an assumption, and we'll be hitting on this point again. But for right now, telling quotation by Zucktundi and Pauling, they say that molecular systematics is largely based on the assumption that degree of overall similarity reflects degree of relatedness. So again, that's using kind of the same assumption here, which is that scientists, they build these kind of phylogenetic trees. But when I say phylogenetic trees, the tree of life, for example, or like family trees of life, and so these scientists are building phylogenetic trees by comparing traits like of particular organisms, whether those traits be anatomical, like I said, or DNA molecules or DNA sequences. They're working off of the assumption that the more similarity there are between those two organisms, then the more closely related they are ancestrally through common descent. Now, and this is actually quite a fundamental role or fundamental position within evolutionary biology. And what strengthens the overall case is the fact that there's multiple consistencies between those family trees, right? So one of the strongest kind of arguments for universal common descent is the fact that these trees are so consistent across different sets of data. Now, a common example is that scientists can construct a family tree based off of something like bone structures, and then they can also construct a family tree based off of something like genes or like gene segments. What happens is that these two family trees turn out to be nearly identical, right? So again, that kind of strengthens the overall claim that these species have been diverged from or are converged from a particular origin. And so this also happens even within genetic kinds of phylogenetic trees, where you can build a tree from one particular gene. Let's say it's a gene for hemoglobin, and then you can rerun the tree with another particular gene, right? And so what you can do is you can then compare those two trees, even though those genes were independent. We see that the phylogenetic trees are still very consistent with each other. And so, yeah, that congruence is taken as very strong evidence that there's a real kind of pattern of occurring in history. And this point is actually reiterated by Dawkins himself. So Richard Dawkins, he says famously, comparative DNA or protein evidence can be used to decide on the evolutionary assumption which pairs of animals are closer cousins than which others. What turns this into extremely powerful evidence for evolution is that you can construct a tree of genetic resemblances separately for each gene in turn. And the important result is that every gene delivers approximately the same tree of life. Once again, this is exactly what you would expect if you were dealing with a true family tree. It's not what you would expect if a designer had surveyed the whole animal kingdom and picked and chosen or borrowed the best proteins for the job, wherever in the animal kingdom they may find it. So, the point here, especially from this quote, is that every independent genetic comparison that you can investigate, it shows a similar family tree. And so, according to Dawkins, this kind of lines up perfectly with what common descent predicts to begin with. And it would be very unlikely if there is a separate design scenario where God is like implementing or borrowing the best kinds of proteins that are consistent within these particular organisms. And so we'll break this down further in a couple of slides, but that is taken as one of the stronger proofs for the theory of evolution. And so he says, Dawkins, in an interview that he had back in, I think, 2015, perhaps even earlier than that, but he says the same thing. He says, you get the same family tree. You also get the same family tree if you take genes that are no longer functional, that are just vestigial, and they're not doing anything. This is overwhelmingly strong evidence. The only way you can get out of saying that this proves evolution is by saying that the intelligent designer, God, deliberately set out to lie to us, deliberately set out to deceive us. And so what he's doing here is that he's arguing that even in terms of DNA sequences that are somewhat broken or they're quote unquote junk, even if you map out trees based off of those genes, you would still get a very similar phylogenetic tree. And so that again strengthens the case that there's genuine ancestry occurring within history. And so a noticeable point here is that he argues that the only way you can get out of this particular grouping is if you have this ad hoc assumption that God fabricated evidence that misled us into investigating our conclusion. And again, we'll touch on this stuff a bit later, but it's telling that you can already see the assumptions in play, you can already see the kinds of intuition that they're using. And if you guys watch the first episode, we went over what those justification patterns are, whether those be intuition, Occam's razor, simplicity, predictions, and whatnot. You will see that a lot of that stuff is shining through in this discourse. And so, to summarize the overall argument for why a lot of evolutionary biologists end up using or end up conceding to universal common descent, it's primarily because of four things, right? So, the first of which is that all living things, when you compare them, they show a consistent pattern of similarity that can be arranged as a branching tree. And the second is that we see the same hierarchical pattern in morphology, in DNA, and even in non-functional elements, which again, when you're using these independent data sources and they're all lining up and giving you the same consistent tree of life, that's very strong proof that they, or according to them, it's really strong proof that they come from one particular ancestor. And they also invoke inference, right? The third argument is that the best explanation is that this really is a family tree, right? In the sense that all these organisms truly descended from one common ancestor in a branching pattern. And so again, this is the case because they're using inference or the principle of parsimony. And we've discussed this already in the first episode, but we'll discuss it again in a couple of slides. Now, finally, like they conclude that again, the best explanation for this is real common ancestry. And they would say that the alternative or the null hypothesis to this explanation, which is design, they would argue that invokes more entities, and they would say that you would have to mimic the same pattern deliberately, which is somewhat ad hoc. And so at the end of the day, what they're saying is basically they're using Occam's razor and they're using the duck test, and they're saying, look, if it looks like a duck and it swims like a duck and it quacks like a duck, then it's probably a duck. And so by analogy, they're saying life looks like one big family tree, and so it probably is one big family tree. Now, like I mentioned, there's a lot of assumptions behind some of these arguments. And it's from the get go, it's easy to see why this is seen as a kind of persuasive argument for universal common descent. But once you break down these assumptions, you see how the entire argument somewhat breaks down, right? And so, what are these assumptions? The first assumption is that similarity is assumed to mean common ancestry rather than common design or mere coincidence, right? So, in other words, like I said before, the assumption is quite telling. It's that because there is similarity, whether that be genetic, whether that be anatomical, physiological, whatever it may be, because there is similarity, then therefore it's closely related or it's common descent. We'll be breaking this down further, but that's not necessarily always held even within the literature, right? So again, within the literature, this is called homology, where similarity is due to common descent. But then there's also alternatives such as homoplasy. And recently, in fact, there is even more development on this issue. So someone like Professor Dennis Noble, he recently had a major debate with Richard Dawkins, and maybe in a future episode I can go and expand on this a bit more. But what he showed, and Dennis Noble's not, he's not a nobody, right? He has had over 500 peer-reviewed articles that he's published on Nature, the most reputable evolutionary biology journal. And so he is the leading expert in the field right now on evolution. And he has gone out and famously shown that these changes and mutations in the DNA, neo-Darwinism doesn't really account for that level of diversity in life. And so he has an issue with saying that randomness can account for those kinds of genetic abnormalities or genetic mutations within a genome. And that's quite telling because he's essentially saying that different mutations are not necessarily, let's just say, function or similarities within genetic DNA and stuff. That's not necessarily due to homology. There's a huge aspect of homoplasy as well. In the literature, homoplasy, as a definition, it means when you find similarity, whether that be anatomical, whether that be genetic, but when you find those kinds of similarity within organisms, but they're actually conclusively proven not to be due to common descent. So it's quite telling that the assumption itself, even within the literature, even within the evolutionists themselves, they concede that not all similarity is due to common descent. So off the get go, we already see that there is a falsification of this assumption. And so another assumption is that it assumes that intelligent design would not create a nested like pattern, right? So again, just to recap, one of the arguments we went through was that the evolutionary kind of paradigm, once we start looking at organisms, we see that there is this nested hierarchy where you have groups within groups, right? But for that to be considered actual evidence for evolution, you have to first rule out that a designer could not or would not create a nested hierarchy kind of pattern. And again, this is something that you have to philosophize. This is not observable evidence. This is not something that you can put underneath a microscope and empirically observe what a designer would do and what a designer wouldn't do. And so we'll be touching on this in a bit more detail in a few slides, right? And another assumption is that it treats the observed pattern as if there's only one cause for those observed patterns. In this case, that cause would be descent, and that any other kind of alternative hypothesis for that kind of observed pattern is seen as ad hoc or deceptive, right? As if someone went out and had to purposefully make it seem that way. And so we'll be looking at that as well in a bit more detail. So the first assumption, as I said, is that common design is an explanation, right? Now, you can just as easily invoke common design, right? So just as human engineers reuse successful design patterns, it's not unintuitive to say that something like a creator, whether that be intelligent, whether that be natural, whatever it may be, it's not unintuitive to say that particular design or that particular designer could have reused kind of the same effective biological design across different organisms. And so, if life was a product of an intelligent designer, that designer could simply employ common solutions in multiple species, which leads to this kind of nested hierarchy that we see observed in biology anyways. Again, under this view, a nested hierarchy or a tree-like grouping of life could still emerge. It's not contradictory to say that because something is designed, that it wouldn't appear as a nested hierarchy. And again, that kind of breaks down the assumption that just because there is similarity, that doesn't necessitate that there is common ancestry. That can equally be the case that because there is similarity, then there is a common designer. So, as a parity argument, if the argument is that similarity is due to common descent, it can also be the case that similarity is due to common designer or common design, right? And so, what that implies is that really, if you're invoking a single origin event because of the fact that there's so much consistency in the similarity, then equally a designer or a common design advocate could just say that the similarity is due, again, it is due to a common origin point, but in this case, it would just be one particular god as opposed to multiple different gods or some type of polytheistic notion of theism. And once again, the implication is that the mere existence of a tree pattern within nature doesn't automatically rule out design, because a designer could choose to create a pattern or reuse components, and the pattern that we might see resulted from a common designer would be very similar to that of a common descent. Now, some people argue that this is somewhat circular or ad hoc, because at the end of the day, you can just say that anything is designed, right? If you're willing to say that designer can mimic any kind of similarity that's found in nature, then that is, first of all, not testable. But second of all, it's, again, it's ad hoc, because you can use that for practically any single shred of evidence that evolutionists bring up, right? And to respond to that kind of criticism, it's not the case that we're invoking something ad hoc, right? We're not saying that because there is similarity, then therefore there is the necessary interrelation between that and common design. But what we're saying is that on the flip side, we can't use similarity as a basis for homology, because of the fact that we were already given, or the source code that we're given, for anyone who has studied biology, you would know that there's about 20 amino acids, and they're known as the universal code. And so because the DNA code is universal, you can only produce a particular number of variations from those 20 amino acids, right? So it's intuitive and it's quite common to already presuppose that you're only given a select few number of proteins available to even begin with. To flesh this out more clearly, we know that under the central dogma, DNA goes to RNA and RNA goes to protein. So if you're doing an investigation and you're seeing multiple proteins that look similar, right? To what extent can you conclude homology just based off of that similarity alone, and at least within the genetic world? And the answer to that is that you're already restricting the number of proteins to begin with. Because of the fact that the universal code or the DNA code is universal, what that means is that every protein only comes from 20 particular amino acids. And because it only comes from 20 of those amino acids, you're already limited in terms of how many proteins you're going to have to begin with. So it's actually expected under both design and evolution that you'll have a lot of similarity to begin with, because everything that exists in the world, all of the life forms that exist and all of the different variations of protein, they only have access to 20 amino acids, right? So you're limited to the number of proteins you have even to begin with. And because of that limit, just look at how many life forms exist in the world, right? There's billions and billions of life forms. And because of that similarity, and every single organism is using those same 20 amino acids, what you get at the end of the day is an overarching number of similarity in those genetic patterns, right? So that's not something that is predictive, right? It's not that powerful in terms of explanatory scope, because of the fact that design is as predictive of those 20 amino acids as is the universal common ancestry, right? But it's not that telling they have similarity, right? Because before we even invoke both hypotheses, we can already note that there should be more similarity. I hope that kind of makes sense here. Everything's coming out from 20 amino acids. There's not that much diversity. Now, there's another point here, is that the universal DNA code being universal is actually something that's being contested too, right? So this is something that when I was an undergrad, they kind of brought that point home, that the DNA sequence or the DNA code is universal and it's found universally within every organism. And that was seen as very strong proof for evolution. But I'll be showing it in future episodes. That particular code itself is actually coming, there's newer evidence that's coming out, and it's showing that it's actually not as universal as we thought it was. But regardless, the point here is that it's not really ad hoc to invoke design, primarily because the design advocate is not saying that similarity is, there's a necessary internal relation between similarity and design, but rather that if you're willing to grant that similarity looks like common descent, then as a parity, you can say the same thing with regards to design, that because there is consistency in the DNA codes or in phylogenetic markings or within physiology or anatomy, then therefore there is a common universal designer for those things. Now, so if you've gone through the first episode, we touched on what's called the duck test on Occam's razor. We talked about invoking possibilities, and this kind of touches on that point once again. And so what essentially the evolutionist is saying is that it looks like a tree, and so therefore it probably is a tree. But on the flip side, if you're invoking this kind of intuition and you're using this as your basis, and if an evolutionist is saying, look, it looks like a tree, and that's the intuitive position, and the onus or the kind of the one who needs to provide proof against it is the one who's rejecting this intuition that's so widespread, then on the flip side, a design advocate or someone who rejects universal common descent, they could say the same thing, right? They can say something like, "Oh, it looks designed," or they can say something like, "It looks like there's multiple common origins, not just a single common origin." They would dismiss that intuition for their own intuition, right? And multiple evolutionists, they also dismiss the intuition of others as well. And so this is just one of those cases of very cherry picking what looks better and what doesn't look better. And so you can go to the first episode, really, where I touch on this topic a bit more and I talk about design and how multiple evolutionary advocates themselves are claiming that there is this concept of design in the universe and it looks intuitive, but despite that, they dismiss it as an illusion. And so this is some of those advocates that I was talking about. So Dawkins and Crick, they've claimed multiple times that there seems to be this appearance of design within the universe, and they take that as intuitive. But once again, when it comes to arguments like this, evolutionists are quick to dismiss these kinds of intuitions or their own intuition to strengthen their overall case. Now, we're going to touch on Occam's razor once again. So, as a refresher from the first episode, we've said that there's multiple different versions of Occam's razor. And a particular version is that you basically want to prefer the simpler explanation, which is the one that posits fewer assumptions, right? So, in the case of universal common descent, it's argued that kind of universal common descent explains all of life through one branching process, and it doesn't really require new entities, such as design or such as like an intelligent designer. And you can extrapolate this kind of overall argument that because there are fewer assumptions on evolution or on universal common descent, then that should be preferred over design based arguments. And yeah, we'll be looking at this a bit more, but what's essentially being showed here is that adding a creator or kind of multiple creation events, it's seen as somewhat unnecessary in terms of complexity. And this is because, again, evolution doesn't require the designer, whereas a design advocate is particularly invoking design. I addressed this issue in the first episode as well, but this is just really as a refresher to that. And if you guys followed along, the way I responded to that issue is that you can basically criticize how you're defining simplicity here, right? If you're using it as fewer assumptions, if that is the way that we're defining Occam's razor, which is that the best explanation is the one that has fewer assumptions, then it's not necessarily the case that common descent has fewer assumptions than common design, right? And also, for example, one of the assumptions are unseen ancestors, right? So if life is all related, then there have existed countless forms of these intermediate kind of transitional species, and that we actually don't have fossils, right? So we have to infer that they existed. Now, again, these are assumptions. You're building extra entities onto your argument. Even though these transitional species we have direct observation for them, we're inferring them because of the fact that universal common descent is true, right? So if you're working off of that assumption, you're inferring these assumptions. I'm going to go ahead and skip this argument because I've already mentioned this and I responded to it in the first episode. But if anyone wants more insight on this argument, just go back to that episode. When it comes to Occam's razor, also in terms of explanatory scope, many evolutionists, they say that common descent is one overall explanation for everything, whereas design, or that be creation, would be like a separate explanation in addition to natural processes. But you can also argue that an intelligent designer is a simple unifying cause as well, right? So this is more for those who are adequate with philosophy, but there's something called the PSR, or the principle of sufficient reason. And what's this argument is showing is that there's this notion that evolution has a greater explanatory scope and it can satisfy the PSR more than it can satisfy, let's say, God or an intelligent designer. But it's actually the other way around, right? Something like evolution can't account for things like randomness as a sufficient explanation, right? So whether or not randomness is a sufficient explanation is very controversial, right? If I said, who cut my hair? And you said something like, oh, it randomly cut itself, that would seem to many people unintuitive, right? It would also seem to many people as not a sufficient explanation for why your hair was cut, right? And so the idea here is that if you had a god or if you had an intelligent designer, that would provide a greater explanatory scope because now you're positing more a single unifying cause in terms of how you flesh out theology, right? And here again, you're reframing simplicity, where now you go from having multiple steps or having unsatisfied explanations to having a unified explanation. So this goes through the fact that you're dismissing intuition based off of your own particular conceived notions. And on the other hand, whenever you're in that situation, you're willing to use your intuition. Right. Now, when you're evaluating the logic behind universal common descent, it's also really important to avoid circular reasoning, right? And with regards to a lot of the common descent advocates, there are a number of circular reasoning. The first of which is that scientists build explanatory trees by assuming that ancestry and descent are already occurring within their own algorithms, right? So that's circular. Why are you making a phylogenetic tree based off of similarity? And then they would say, oh, it's because these similarities are showing homology. And then you'd ask, okay, what's the proof for homology? And then they would point to those same trees that they used on the assumption of homology to grant those trees as evidence for homology. So that's again a huge level of circular reasoning. You're using an assumption to build your evidence, and then to prove your assumption, you're using that as your evidence. And so, like, that is particularly circular reasoning. There's a number of further kinds of kind of circular reasoning that's occurring, but this is really the most pivotal and the most vital one. And you will always see this within evolutionary discourses, within wherever there's this debate. The number one evidence for homology that they bring up is the fact that there is similarity within these phylogenetic trees, and that these phylogenetic trees are looking quite consistent with one another. But again, that those trees are built off of the assumption that homology is already taking place. Now, really, the debate over universal common descent, kind of like the logic of it, it's not about data. I hope that's very clear here. So it's not as if an evolutionist is taking data and a design advocate is rejecting the data. But on the other hand, it's that they both are using data. It's how you're interpreting the data, which are based off of your philosophical viewpoints, right? And Dawkins, as I mentioned earlier on, he said that if design is true, then the designer is being deceptive, or he's making it look as if we evolved. And again, this is a philosophical claim. It's not a scientific one. So he's the line of this kind of reasoning. It's that religious people are blind in a sense, right? They are invoking certain ad hoc explanations in this kind of dichotomous way, where it's out to invalidate the evidence or invalidate the data. But again, it's not, there is no particular data that's being used to falsify or to even accept universal common descent. It's a philosophical notion, right? It's a particular worldview that is designed, and it clusters into these kinds of taxonomic hierarchizations, but it's not the data itself. It's how you're analyzing the data that gets you to universal common descent. And again, I haven't really so far in the series, I haven't opened up the door to that data, because we're not looking at all the data that exists currently. We're first looking at all these philosophical assumptions behind those data, so that once we get to that kind of data, and once we get to the actual evidence or the meat of the entire discussion, you would see really where these evolutionists are kind of invoking their own philosophical notions, and they're selectively understanding the data in a particular light. And once we understand those notions, and once we understand where that level of the kind of manipulation is coming from, then we'll be able to truly address the actual evidence behind evolution to begin with. And really, just as a taster, you would see that a lot of the assumptions that are occurring on the evolutionary level, once there is a particular piece of evidence that's brought for universal common descent and it ends up failing, you would see that what these evolutionists do is that they have these auxiliary principles that they add onto universal common descent. And once the evidence fails, universal common descent doesn't fail. Instead, that particular auxiliary postulation, that kind of thing fails, rather than universal common descent. So again, we'll be looking at the data much more closely, but it's important to know that this debate really isn't about data. It's about logic. It's about how you're using your particular worldview to shape your understanding of evolution to begin with. And another kind of teaser, if you like, is that for a lot of evolutionary advocates, the reason why they are so adamant about homology is because they view something called RNA world hypothesis, which is that they view what's known as self-replicating ribosomes as the basis for life. And what they are arguing is that it's so inconceivable and improbable that this has ever happened, right? And because it's so implausible and inconceivable that it happened, and the fact that it did happen, that means that it's very low probability that we exist to begin with, right? And because it's such a low probability, the null hypothesis has to be random. And for some people, I'm not really making much sense right now because I haven't really gone through these preliminary conversations yet. But once we go through it, you understand what I mean by null hypothesis being random. And once you have that assumption, and we'll be looking at this further in the next episode, actually, where once you have your null hypothesis as being random, then any hypothesis is better than randomness. That's why universal common descent always wins out in this debate, because the null hypothesis to what's the alternative hypothesis, right? What's the alternative to universal common descent? For an evolutionist, the alternative, because if we were trying to test common descent, we have to invoke something that's falsifiable, right? So if the hypothesis is universal common descent, the null hypothesis has to be randomness. They can't add God into the equation because for them it's philosophical naturalism, right? So like you can't invoke supernatural entities. So it's a clash between common descent and randomness, and because of that, common descent always wins out. But again, I'll be going over this in much more detail. So yeah, so like I said, naturalism underlies the debate. With regards to how science is operated, it always uses methodological naturalism, which is that it only allows natural causes, right? So I went through this a bit more in detail in last episode, where I talked about how multiple evolutionists have to exclude design before the data is even brought to them to begin with. And like I said, in the next episode, we'll be going over this entire conundrum and whether or not universal common descent is even testable if you're willing to exclude any kind of null hypothesis. And so the summary of the logic behind it, essentially it's that there's this remarkable similarity between different tree patterns of life. And whether you're looking at DNA, anatomy, or even kind of junk DNA material, all of those uniquely and consistently give us a simple tree where we can group things in terms of branches, in terms of cousin relationships, and all of that. And so that is seen as support for universal common descent. But again, the underlying assumption here is that the more similarity you have, that means there is descent of some kind, right? And not just that, but then the other assumption is that we can't invoke design because that is implausible. And again, I'll explain why it's implausible in future episodes. For right now, just that is really what the evolutionists are saying, right? And so some of the counterpoints that I brought, well, the first of which was the appearance of design, which is that if you're willing to use intuition in one sense, then intuition can also be used for this aspect of design as well. And then the other one is that if you're using Occam's razor, the claim that evolution is simpler, that is also challenged by pointing out that there's multiple unobserved intermediate forms. And again, I told you guys that if you want more insight on that, you can go to the first episode. Both of those so far have been explained in more detail in the first episode. And then the third thing I brought was that the possibility of common design being an alternative explanation for similarity is actually quite intuitive in the sense that we would expect, if the argument is that similarity is due to common descent, then we can also expect similarity being due to a common designer, in the sense that there's only one monotheistic designer as opposed to polytheistic designers. And also, we talked about how there's this underlying kind of circular reasoning amongst evolutionists in the sense that they're using phylogenetic trees to prove their case with regards to homology, but then they're also using homology as the assumption to build those trees to begin with. And just a final point, I should have mentioned this earlier, but a final argument really for these phylogenetic trees is that truly, like, gene sequences and similarities in genomes and similarities in, let's say, having a consistent tree based off of functional genes, that doesn't really tell us anything, right? The reason why it doesn't tell us anything like new is because, again, it's expected, right? Let's say you have blue eyes, like your phenotype for your eye color is blue, then it's expected that your gene will also be encoded for a blue eye, right? Now, if, for example, let's say you see that blue eyes in a cat, right? And then you also see blue eyes in, let's say, a human being, right? Then it's expected that the not just the phenotype would be the same, but it's also expected that the actual genotype itself would be the same as well. So the actual gene for your blue eyes would be the same in the human than it would as it would be in the cat, right? So it's expected. It's overlooking this level of simplicity, right? Evolution as assumption, like to claim that we are related to cats because we both have blue eyes, right? That's not something that is that's something that's missing the point, the overall point, because we're not adding anything new here. There's only 20 amino acids, and all those amino acids code for the same thing. And so that's why if you have blue eyes found in one species and you have blue eyes found in another species, it's expected that there will be a similar genome and genes of that particular allele. Or for example, let's say I have 5 fingers and another species have 5 fingers. Because our anatomy is same in this case, that doesn't imply common ancestry because of the fact that having 5 fingers on my hand versus having 5 fingers on another organism, that itself is expected given the anatomical feature itself, right? So if my genome encodes 5 fingers and another species also encodes 5 fingers, again, we're not really adding anything new. The anatomy really just mimics the genome level, right? I'll explain this further in future episodes, but I hope that kind of makes more sense. But yeah, just as a recap, what we'll be doing in the next episode is we'll be testing universal common ancestry, and we'll be showing how there's these auxiliary principles that are added on top of the overall notion of universal common descent. And because of that, universal common descent gets protected. It's in a privileged area where predictions can't falsify it really. And then we'll be looking at that itself will span a couple of episodes, right? Maybe 2 or 3 episodes just on whether or not universal common descent is actually testable. And then we'll be talking about a few more logical assumptions. And then finally, the last maybe 4 or 5 episodes of the series, we'll be going over the actual evidence for evolution. Once we've broken down these assumptions and once we've shown why those assumptions are false, we'll be truly looking at the evidence and we can finally discern off of those particular notions whether or not universal common descent is true.